Should we even fix traditional publishing? This episode, a conversation with prolific author, teacher, and publisher Zetta Elliott.
I've decided that since teachers, are clamoring for these books to use in the classroom, it makes more sense for me to self-publish and get the books directly to the teachers and the kids.
I'm Chris Well, and this is DIY Author. You're an author. Maybe you're taking the traditional route. Maybe you've chosen an independent path. Or maybe you want the best of both worlds. Wherever you want to go as a writer, DIY Author is here to help you on your journey with advice, encouragement, and practical tips. Because do it yourself doesn't have to mean do it alone. Welcome to DIY Author. I'm your host, Chris Well. Our guest this episode is Zetta Elliott. She's a teacher, as well as a prolific and award-winning writer. Her works include children's books, novels, poems, essays, and stage plays. She has also launched her own publishing imprint, Rosetta Press. Coming up, we discuss how she serves a readership that has been ignored by traditional publishing, why she tells her students to go read on the subway, and why she decided it was better to be a writer than an activist. But first, our latest author tip comes from Terry Whalen, author of Book Proposals That Sell. Here's that tip. Read your writing aloud before sending it off to the editor, and never trust your spell checker. Good tip from Terry Whalen. Find him online at thewritinglife.ws and terrywhalen.com. If you have an author tip or any other comments or suggestions, there are all kinds of ways to contact us. You can leave a voice message or you can email us through diyauthor.com/tips, that's TIPS, or you can just go to diyauthor.com and look for our contact page. And now for my interview with teacher and author Zetta Elliott. And now I'm speaking with Zetta Elliott. She is let me look at the list here. You are a poet and an author. You write for a wide age range. You're an instructor. There's a lot of things that go in the description for you. So I guess first of all, say hello to the people.
Hi, everybody.
And how do you describe yourself?
Oh, wow. I primarily identify as a writer and educator. At the moment, I'm a professor, and I've actually just tendered my resignation, so I won't be a professor as of September for the first time in quite a long time.
Breaking news.
Yes, but I'm still an educator, and I work fairly closely with kids. I was just in a middle school on Monday, giving a presentation to teachers who will be using my books in the classroom. So teaching is important to me, and I'm a better writer when I'm teaching. I'm a better teacher when I'm writing. So for me, the goal is always to find the right kind of balance. And I think the year ahead for me is really about focusing more on being a publisher. I have a huge backlog of unpublished material, and I have decided it's no longer worth my while to wait for the publishing industry to recognize my brilliance. So I've decided that since teachers, are clamoring for these books to use in the classroom, it makes more sense for me to self-publish and get the books directly to the teachers and the kids.
So you are self-publishing, but you are actually creating a business around that. Rosetta Press.
Rosetta Press, yeah. So my name is Rosetta, and I go by Zetta, and that was also my grandmother's name. And I don't even have a photograph of my grandmother. Unfortunately, she passed away when my dad was a teenager in the Caribbean. So when my father named me for his mother, I became more interested not only in her story, but in the ways in which certain people are silenced and or made invisible. So Rosetta Press is a press in the Black feminist tradition, like Kitchen Table Press, founded by Barbara Smith and Audre Lorde. Women of color for generations have been self-publishing because it is, as hard as it is for anybody to get published, it's particularly hard for people of color, and I think women of color especially. So Rosetta Press is a way for me to focus on my Black feminist politics and values, which means moving people who have been silenced and or marginalized back to the center where they can have a voice. And I'm not taking new material from other authors right now, but possibly in the next 5 to 10 years, I would think about doing that. For the most part, like I said, I have 25 unpublished manuscripts, and so I'm really just trying to find a way to get my work out into the world so it can serve the people that I intended it for it to serve.
Now, the most recent books listed when I went online They're all children's books, and they came out within a number of days of each other. Are they reissues, or are these all brand new?
So it depends on how you would define brand new. So this is the first time they've been in print.
Okay.
These are stories that I wrote when I first began writing for kids back in 2000 and 2001. And I was writing stories because I was teaching in an after-school program, teaching creative writing to children. And we did a section on picture books and children's books, and I couldn't find examples of the books that I wanted to show to my students, who were primarily kids of color on the Upper West Side. And so I started making demos myself. I wrote the stories, I illustrated them, I bound them, and the kids just loved them. And so from that point forward, I started writing for kids, but I didn't understand the picture book format, which is generally, it should be around 1,000 words. So those first stories that I wrote were somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 words. And I realized that they're really chapter books. They're for older readers, maybe like 6 to 10 years old. And I thought having them illustrated and printing them, publishing them as chapter books made more sense. And so I had 5 books planned for release this spring. And I have illustrators all over the world, but my one U.S. illustrator is a little bit slow. And so instead of there being 5 books at once, there were 4. And I'll probably try to do another 4 in the fall as well.
4 is still pretty good.
I don't recommend to anyone doing 4 books at once. That was not smart, but I learned a lot along the way. And it is great to be able to walk into a school with really a stack of books and to say, fan them out in front of a teacher and say which one works for you, or the kids, fan them out in front of a group of kids and watch their hands, grab for them. So that's really rewarding.
Well, I guess that does speak to, there are a lot of authors that they'll have a book and they're wanting to go full bore. Oh, I'm going to take this one book that I have and go to the library or teachers. There is something about, because you're working on a cluster, it's that much, then it takes the same amount of effort to sell 1 or 4, but it kind of amortizes the effort.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think when I told my friend that I was planning to publish 5 books at once, she said, oh, no, that's not how it works. You have to ration them. You have to pace yourself. You have to stage them. And I think that's precisely what the publishing industry, the traditional publishing industry does, is that they try to create a sense of scarcity in order to heighten the value of something. And I just don't feel like that's an appropriate model for the groups that I'm trying to target, specifically schools. And if I think about, something like the Scholastic Book Fair, which goes into a school and sets up shop, and most of the teachers I've spoken to are very dissatisfied. They don't like what's being offered, and many of them are opting out of it or looking for an alternative. So to be able to walk into a school as almost like your own book fair, and to be able to say, I have novels, I have middle grade novels, young adult novels, I have, a range of options. I think that made more sense to me as a business model.
Going back to I mentioned earlier, there's all these different things in your bio. And I'm amazed. You are a poet, you write stage plays, and then, you write for different age groups. You have sci-fi and YA, children's books. How do you decide from one project to the next which one of those you want to be?
Yeah. I've never felt bound by genre. And because I simply identify as a writer, I feel like all options are on the table. And so, ironically, the first things that I had published were my poems. And I absolutely do not identify as a poet, but it was, the easiest thing to get published. And then once I had something in print, I had more confidence to kind of branch out and try other things. I always thought of myself as a novelist, and I think probably at heart, when I'm telling a story, that's the way I prefer to tell it. But, I wrote my first novel in 1999 and had all these agents interested, and this is going to happen for me, and it didn't. And then, like I said, I was working in an after-school program writing for kids, so I spent about 2 years writing for kids and accumulated about 20 manuscripts. And then I went to Africa, and my dad passed away from cancer, and I wrote a memoir about that. And then I went to playwriting, and I wrote about 20 plays, and kind of, I wouldn't say I got it out of my system, but I think when I'm learning a new form, that's precisely what I'm doing, is that I'm studying a form and I'm learning it, and I'm trying not necessarily to perfect it, but to see what I can actually do within that format. And then I went back to novels, and I'm an academic, so I also have to produce scholarly writing, and I blog. I think, someone said to me, oh, you're so prolific, and I don't think of myself that way, but I think, when you're a writer, you feel compelled to write. I mean, that's the way I communicate best. I don't talk a lot. Have a lot of days where I don't speak to anybody, except when I'm, going into schools and doing talks and things like that, or with my friends. But for the most part, that's the way I communicate best. as a scholar, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. There just isn't one hat that does it all. So being able to switch hats and to try different things, I know some people think that makes you a dilettante, but I was never really interested in mastery. I'm more interested in innovation and trying new things.
Yeah, they're all stories, and I love that each of them has a strength that the other does not, and exploring those differences.
Exactly. So I would say that the years that I spent writing plays, I'm not a theater person. I don't go to the theater very often, but I came out of that period in my writing life writing much stronger dialogue. And so now when kids read my novels, or adults even, they rush up and say, when is it going to be made into a movie? And I think my writing style has become almost cinematic in a way, because it is very dramatic, very much driven by dialogue, and I learned that through playwriting. I think you're right. I think each format, each genre teaches you something that can be applied in the next.
All right, let's talk a bit about your tools. And you told me before the interview that this is going to be a very brief part of the conversation. So what would you? Let's start with physical technology. Do you have any favorite devices or gadgets or computers?
Really, just my laptop, my MacBook Air. And I've been having some technical issues with it, which is making me very nervous because I can't imagine what I would do without it, and I can't take it into the shop and live without it. So my MacBook Air is important. Ironically, I've always had a laptop for, I guess, the past decade, but I don't write outside of the home. I'm a homebody. I write at home. I don't go to cafes. I can't have the distraction, although at home I'm usually sitting in front of the TV with my laptop on my lap. But that's pretty much it in terms of technology. I type fairly quickly, close to 100 words a minute. So when I am ready to write, I can just, sit down and get to it.
So do you have any kind of software or apps that you like or use?
I really don't. I only just got a smartphone like last month. And I'm still figuring out how to use it. And aside from Skype, which I use for author visits sometimes with people who are out of state, that's pretty much it for me.
And you mentioned for a lot of your writing, you do it at home in front of the TV. Is that because that's the most comfortable place for you, or the most convenient place, or the quietest place?
It's bizarre. I mean, my building is very quiet, so I'm fortunate in that regard. I think I used to write with music in the background, and then somehow I transitioned from listening to music to having the TV on. And I think that's part of the way technology has changed our brains, in that I used to be better able to focus. And I think now I actually focus better when I'm working against a distraction. So having the TV on is almost like background noise, but I would miss it if it were off and there were absolute silence in the apartment. I think as I told my students, community college students really struggle with reading. And I would say, go on the subway, right? Go somewhere where your phone doesn't work and you still have noise and things around you, but you've got nothing to do if you're going from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Just sit there with your book and read. And a lot of them told me that actually works for them. If you put yourself in an environment where you still have some stimulation and some distractions, but they're limited enough that you can control them, that's a better way to focus than, say, being above ground, or if they go to Starbucks and try to read a novel. There's just too many things going on in that space for them to really focus on the book.
Now, what part of being an author do you find the most difficult?
The most difficult is certainly being published. And, that's particularly true. I do a lot of advocacy work online around the children's publishing industry. And right now, 93% of the books published each year in the United States, close to 4,000, 93% of those books are about white children. So for writers of color who are trying to break in, it's extremely difficult. And then, of course, if you choose to self-publish, you face the additional bias against indie authors where your books aren't reviewed and many bookstores won't carry your books. We actually have a situation right now where there's a nonprofit bookstore in D.C. called Teaching for Change. They actually run the bookstore out of Busboys and Poets Cafe. And Rush Limbaugh, who has written a children's book and who feels that his book should be in every bookstore in the nation, objects to the fact that this Teaching for Change bookstore focuses on books by and about people of color. So even though he's got, 95% of the market sewn up, and most people of color, if you go into your Barnes & Noble or even many indie stores, you won't find children's books by and about people of color. So to have a place like Teaching for Change that stocks all of my books and reviews and vets all of my books, that's fantastic. But it would help a lot. I'm petitioning some of the major kidlit journals to see if they'll reconsider their policy. Because if you say there's been this huge media campaign, we need diverse books, and so many people are saying, yes, 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 we have a diversity gap. We have all these kids of color coming up in the U.S. and we have no books for them. And we know the industry is disadvantaging writers of color, but we're not going to look at the books of people who are looking for alternative ways to get their stories into print. It's a double bind. So that's the biggest challenge. And the amount of time as an advocate that I have spent on this issue, I had to decide finally last year that I was going to step back. As important as these issues are to me, it was as important, if not more important, for me to focus on my role as author and publisher and making sure that I was putting more stories into the world instead of, simply reminding people that there aren't enough stories in the world.
What problem, although I think I know where this is going to go, what problem with writing was your greatest roadblock and how did you overcome it?
Yes, you probably do know. So the biggest challenge was getting published and was getting editors actually not even to look at my work, because most of the time I would send stories out and I would get these letters, handwritten letters back from editors, which is pretty amazing. And they would say, oh, you write beautifully, but there's no market for this, or it's not right for our list. So the big challenge in some ways was accepting the fact that the system was broken, instead of holding out hope that I was going to be that one person that squeezed through, that one Black author that gets published every year, asking myself, would I keep writing if I never won an award? Would I keep writing if I wasn't earning money? Would I keep writing, all these different conditions, and deciding that no matter what, I'm going to keep writing. So if I'm going to end up with this massive material, and what I really want is for it to be in the hands of kids, then I need to do whatever I can do as an individual to make that happen. So I think that taking that leap and saying, I haven't entirely given up on the system. I'm talking to a couple of traditional editors right now, but, I can't hold my breath and wait for that scenario to work for me, because the truth is it doesn't work for very many people at all.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you see a dinosaur that's getting ready to be extinct. Well, how much time do I need to spend resuscitating the dinosaur?
That's it, right? That's just it. And I know I get a lot of flack because I work with Amazon, and they published 2 of my novels, Amazon, their children's imprint, Skyscape, and I print with CreateSpace. But, I liked what Jeff Bezos had to say. He was like, Amazon didn't happen to publishing. The future happened to publishing. And, I'm willing to work with anybody who's prepared to innovate and be inclusive. But yeah, trying to revive this old dying model that didn't serve very many of us anyways, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Now let's talk about your writing habits. Do you outline? Do you make it up as you go? How do you attack a project?
Yeah, I'm actually working on an outline right now, which can be exhausting and very time consuming, but it's really good for me, I think. So I think initially I hear certain voices for my characters or certain scenarios. I imagine certain dialogues, and I kind of jot those down in a single file. And then what I'm doing right now is I've written, say, like a 2-paragraph summary. So I have a basic sense of how the novel begins, its middle, its end. And then I do a chapter-by-chapter outline, kind of an annotated outline. And so every chapter, this is what's going to happen. And then I plug that into my original file with those little scribblings, so I can see, how much of each chapter I've actually completed, how much more needs to be done, and I have a sense of the sequence. So I definitely use an outline. In the early stages, I'm free to just kind of dream things up. For this novel that I'm working on right now, The Return, I knew the ending. The ending was the first thing I saw, so it helps to know where you're headed, and I got a grant to go to Senegal, so I'll be going there in a couple of weeks to do research. And it helps to go into the trip, into the research with an outline, so I know exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a setting for this particular scene where this and this is going to happen. Yeah, outlines are pretty important for me.
Wait, so is it a fictional work that you're researching for? Okay, so I'm trying to get my head around this. You got a grant to go to a faraway place to research for a fiction title.
Yes.
Okay. How did that happen?
Through my job. So I have to say it's not easy to be an academic, and there are a lot of pressures to do different kinds of writing. But I managed to get, I think, 4 grants altogether in the 3 years that I was at my job. And this latest grant is to conduct research in order to complete the 3rd book in a trilogy, my Geeks and Freaks trilogy. So I've already written 2 of the books, and they've been published, one traditionally by Amazon and one I self-published last fall through Rosetta Press. This 3rd book, The Return, is set in Senegal, and so I, wrote a grant proposal saying I needed to go to investigate certain things and to meet with certain people, and they agreed. So I have this grant. I'm leaving my job in late August, so I have to spend the money before then, so I'm heading off in a couple of weeks.
What is the best thing anyone said about your books?
I mean, it's so nice when anyone comes up and expresses appreciation, but I think just earlier this week I was at a school and I had all these teachers come up to me and a librarian and said, "When is the sequel coming out?" And I was actually at my aunt's funeral last fall, and 2 of my mother's friends came over, and I thought for sure they were going to express their condolences, and they both said, "When is the sequel coming out?" I just thought, holy moly, to think.
Is it me, or is that a little inappropriate?
It seemed odd to me. But at the same time, I guess, it's really flattering to know that people think about your characters that much, that years later, I mean, A Wish After Midnight came out I self-pubbed it in 2008, and then Amazon acquired it and republished it in 2010. So it's been 4 years, and to know that people are still kind of hanging there on that cliff, when is the next part coming? I think that to me is really gratifying. It's also a little anxiety producing because I need to finish that novel this summer as well. But that makes me feel good to know that people felt such an attachment to the character and to the narrative that they just wanted to keep going.
What does your editing process look like?
Ew. So I right now do not work with an editor. I am my own editor. I'm a professor and I teach writing, and I read a lot of poorly written student essays, and I do a lot of correcting, and I'm not a perfect writer, but I'm a pretty good writer, and I tend to write. I don't do very rough drafts. I think when I do get ready to sit down and write, I always say that writing is 70% dreaming. So after I have spent all that time dreaming and I am sitting down ready to write, it comes out quite quickly, and it comes out in complete phrases and paragraphs. And so I usually have a fairly complete draft, and then I go back and fill in any blanks and make any kind of continuity corrections that I need to, especially if it's a sequel. I print a couple of dummies on CreateSpace. I send it to friends. And usually if there's something glaring, someone will let me know. I did have one of those 4 children's illustrated chapter books that I sent out. Like I said, don't do 4 at once, because I did have a friend email me and say, "Oh, we caught a couple of typos." And they were very small, but self-published authors don't get a pass. Virtually any traditionally published book you read, you'll find something a copy editor missed, and that's okay.
Right.
But self-published authors, you don't get a pass on that. Somebody will completely condemn you and everything you've ever written based on something you misspell. So fortunately, with something like print on demand, you can simply make the correction and keep going. It's possible that down the road I'll think about hiring an editor. I'm aware of my limitations, and for the longer, more involved stories, I think an editor is probably a good idea.
What is the best thing you've done to promote your work?
Well, I would say that being on the radio tends to be extremely effective, and I know I had a chance to be on WNYC when my novel, A Wish After Midnight, came out, and just the immediate jump in sales was something I had never experienced before. But I do think that, I work closely with the Brooklyn Public Library, and they send me into schools to do author presentations and writing workshops, and that, in a way, has been the best thing for me, because I've met so many teachers and so many kids, and to actually see firsthand how kids are reacting to your work, to listen to what it is they're looking for, what they wish they had to read. And then, at the end of the school year, I have this huge list of schools that I have visited and educators and librarians. And so every time a book comes out, I have my list of contacts to send it to. I have a ready-made audience for the book. So that's been really useful for me in a local way.
How involved are you in the design of your books?
Very, because it's just me. So I would say up until these last 4 books, I worked with friends. And I was lucky that I had a number of friends who are graphic artists and illustrators, and they helped me to put my trailers together and all those different kinds of things. But it's expensive, So when I decided to do 4 books at once, and had the idea that I was going to try to do 4 or 5 books every season for the next couple of years, a cousin of mine recommended E-Lance, And so I've been using designers and illustrators on Elance, and it's really, really worked out well for me, I have to say. I do have that one illustrator in the U.S. who's a little slower than I had hoped, but I found an illustrator in India and in Honduras and in Vietnam, and they do beautiful artwork, exactly what I've asked for, fairly quickly, a bit longer than maybe projected, and it's affordable. It means that I can put out, multiple books at once and not break the bank. So I met a friend recently who, did a Kickstarter and raised money for her book. And I just don't think I could do that if I'm planning to put out, 8 books a year. So being able to find affordable artists and designers and illustrators internationally has been really a boon for me.
Now, so the 4 that just came out, they look like they belong together. So how do you get people that are completely different places to do something that looks like it belongs together? Right.
So I did, if when you go on Elance and you post a job, I did say, I'm looking for an artist to work on one book, which will be part of a series. So none of those artists, knew each other or were collaborating with each other. But in my mind, I knew what I wanted the covers to look like from jump. What I didn't know was what kind of illustrations they would produce. So I didn't hire anyone to do the covers until the end. And then I hired a designer in Indonesia, actually. And I said to her, this is what I'm looking for. And she usually gave me something that was actually a little bit better than what I'd had in mind. So, the books are all the same trim size. They're all 7x10. I knew I wanted vibrant colors. I wanted a kind of urban aesthetic for a couple of them. I don't know. I think I had a really clear vision in my mind of what they would look like, and came close through this designer. So she'll be doing the 5th book and hopefully future books. And she was just really easy to work with. She could, listen to what I was saying and tell me what was possible and what wasn't.
This is the designer you're talking about?
Right.
Who is she?
DZ Suryadi. She's an Indonesian designer.
Does she have a website?
I'm not sure. I found her on Elance.
Okay.
And her name is printed on the back of the book, so I hope people will look her up because she's fantastic. And the really amazing thing about Elance, all the people I've worked with, is that they really want you to be satisfied. And so they quite often will say, unlimited revisions, and they mean it, that you can kind of keep coming back and say, we're so close. Just could you tweak this one more thing? Yeah, she's fantastic.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
Oh, that's tricky. I don't know if I've ever gotten really great advice specific to publishing, but I think just generally, probably it would be my English teacher from high school who said, if you want to be a writer, you will be. And I think I had always imagined that you had to have someone else's permission, or you had to go to school, or you had to take a class, or the idea that you could simply visualize something for yourself and then pursue it and achieve it. I think that's important to me. So when I told people I was leaving my academic job, my potential job for life in New York, most of them were like, don't do it. We can find a way. We'll make it work. And then I had a couple of artist friends who were like, good for you, go for it. And that meant a lot to me. So I think there are a lot of people who watch indie authors, and some of them are hoping we'll fall flat on our face, but so many others are just crossing their fingers and really hoping we can do this because, their vision of what they can achieve for themselves is almost based on what we're able to accomplish. So I do find more and more people who are just full of praise and congratulations and support and really want this to happen and just can't believe it. They're like, wow, you did this in a month? You just did this? And it's yeah, you can just do this. And it is hard work, but it can be done and you can build from there. I don't imagine my books on the bestseller list, and I think of, each project as something that will grow slowly over time. But, it makes more sense to me to have books that circulate than to have a bunch of files on my hard drive that nobody knows about.
And finally, how do people find you online? Your main website is zettaelliott.com, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then are there other places online we can find you?
So my primary blog is zettaelliott.wordpress.com, and that's where you can find most of the updates about what's going on with me and my writing. I'm on Facebook. I have an author page, Author Zetta Elliott, and I am learning to use Twitter more. I mostly use it for announcements, but I'm also on Twitter at Zetta Elliott.
Well, great. All right, I think we've got it. Zetta Elliott, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Chris, for giving me a chance to share my experience.
This has been DIY Author. Please visit us online at DIYauthor.com and be sure to sign up for our email newsletter. If you enjoyed this program, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. Until next time, keep writing. And remember, do it yourself doesn't have to mean do it alone.